Karen wasn't just any ordinary member of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She was the HOA. At least, that's how she saw it. With her neon fluorescent pink visor perched atop her head, a clipboard clutched in one hand, and a latte perpetually in the other, Karen was a self-proclaimed enforcer of the community's values. She patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk, eyes scanning every corner, every lawn, and every driveway for the slightest hint of rebellion against her unwritten code of conduct. Her mission was clear: protect the sanctity of the community, even if that meant policing the most ridiculous of infractions. To her, a single misplaced flower pot or a driveway that wasn't pressure washed just right could be the start of a decline into chaos. It wasn't enough to keep the neighborhood safe. It had to be perfect, according to her standards. The community newsletter, which Karen personally edited and delivered, was her most trusted tool. Passive-aggressive reminders filled every page, warning residents to follow her vision, or else. Residents are kindly reminded that blue trash bins clash with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Please use green bins only. The message was simple but carried the weight of an order, as though failure to comply could unravel the very fabric of the community. It didn't matter if the request was trivial. The color of your trash can or the height of your grass could mean the difference between being a good neighbor and a violator of HOA rules. And in Karen's world, violating the rules wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a personal attack, and she took it personally. Enter Chris, a young, easygoing homeowner who had just moved into the neighborhood. Chris had always dreamed of owning a house in a peaceful, laid-back environment, far away from the chaos of the city. He had found just that in this quiet, suburban neighborhood. But little did he know that the very peace he sought would soon be shattered by a woman whose sole purpose was to dictate every little detail of his life. Chris wasn't exactly the type to follow unnecessary rules. He wasn't a rebel, but he didn't believe in living under the thumb of someone like Karen, especially when her rules made no sense. His new mailbox, a sleek black modern design, was the first to catch her eye. It was too bold, too out of place, in her opinion. In Karen's eyes, the mailbox wasn't just a mailbox, it was an affront to the neighborhood's charm. The first encounter was almost comical in its absurdity. Chris had just moved in, still unpacking boxes and adjusting to his new life. The last thing on his mind was his mailbox. But Karen wasn't so easily dismissed. With clipboard in hand, she marched straight up to his door, not to introduce herself in any friendly way, but to inform him that his mailbox violated HOA standards. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Chris. I noticed your mailbox doesn't align with our HOA guidelines," Karen chirped, her voice too sweet, like a predator luring its prey. "Guidelines?" Chris asked, raising an eyebrow, clearly confused. "Yes, it's a little too bold. We prefer something more traditional, like white with decorative posts," Karen insisted, giving him no room for negotiation. Chris, trying to suppress a laugh, simply nodded and said, "I'll think about it." But in his mind, there was no chance in hell he was replacing his mailbox. He liked it. It was his choice, and Karen's opinion didn't matter. Unfortunately, the mailbox was only the beginning. Soon after, Karen turned her eyes to Chris's lawn. It wasn't perfectly manicured to her exact specifications. The grass, according to her, needed to be cut to precisely 2.5 inches. If it wasn't, she'd be back to issue another violation notice. The pressure on Chris was mounting, but he couldn't care less. His yard was fine the way it was. He wasn't about to let someone dictate his life down to the inch. And then came the next incident that really set the stage for the battle to come. Chris had a small strip of land at the edge of his property. It wasn't much, just a narrow dirt path that led into the community park. He never thought much about it. But to Karen, this strip of land wasn't just a pathway. It was a lifeline, a shortcut that the HOA residents had used for years. It wasn't hers, but in her mind, it might as well have been. The issue began one Saturday morning when Chris noticed a jogger casually running across the strip of land. Then came the dog walkers, the cyclists, and before long, the strip was buzzing with activity like a major highway. Chris looked out his window, watching as his neighbors treated his property like their own personal trail. He scratched his head. "Is there a toll I'm supposed to charge?" he muttered to himself. It felt ridiculous, but Chris was determined not to make a fuss. After all, maybe it was just a one-time thing, right? Wrong. As the weeks passed, more and more people began to use the strip as a shortcut, and Chris began to feel his patience wear thin. One morning, he saw a group of joggers stop to take a selfie in front of the private property sign he had put up, posting it with the caption, "Some people think they own the world." LOL. It was clear that his attempt at marking his territory had only invited more trouble. The breaking point came one evening when Chris returned home to find deep tire tracks running through the dirt path. Someone had driven through it, tearing up the earth like they were testing a monster truck. His heart sank. That's it, he thought, surveying the damage. If they won't respect the sign, I'll give them something they can't ignore. He made up his mind. It was time for a fence. Chris didn't want anything too fancy, just a simple barrier to make his point clear. He called a contractor, placed the order, and scheduled the installation. When the workers arrived, Karen was already lurking nearby. Her eyes locked onto them as if they were intruders in her domain. With clipboard in hand, Karen marched over, seething with indignation. "This construction is unauthorized," she snapped, looking at the workers like they were criminals. "You can't just build a fence without HOA approval." Chris smiled sweetly, his patience worn thin. "Karen, the HOA doesn't own this land. I do." Her eyes burned with fury as she stormed off. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but Chris knew he had won this round. The fence went up by the end of the week, and to add a final touch, Chris put up another sign, "No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Karen's reaction was pure fury. She stood across the street, arms crossed, glaring at the fence like it was a personal affront. But Chris just sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching her rage. He had no intention of backing down, and from that moment, he knew this wasn't going to be a simple neighborhood dispute. This was war. But little did he know, Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and soon, her sense of entitlement would lead her to make one critical mistake that would change everything. Chris had no idea that by erecting a simple fence, he had just lit the fuse of a war that would consume his life for the next several weeks. At first, the peace seemed to return. The fence stood tall, marking the boundary between his property and the land that had once been a community shortcut. The sign, with its stark warning of no trespassing, "Violators will be prosecuted," sent a clear message: this is my land, not yours. But for Karen, this was an insult of the highest order. The woman who had made it her life's work to control every little detail of the neighborhood's existence could not stand being defied. In Karen's world, no one was allowed to challenge her authority, especially not some new guy who thought he could waltz in and change things. It started the very next morning. Chris was sitting on his porch, sipping his usual cup of coffee when he heard the unmistakable sound of a car horn blaring from across the street. His eyes narrowed. He knew exactly who it was before he even looked. Karen was standing in front of his fence, her hands gripping the wheel, honking the horn like she was summoning a battalion of HOA loyalists. She waved her clipboard around furiously, as though the very act of holding it somehow gave her the power to undo Chris's decision. "Chris," she yelled, leaning out of her car window, "you can't just block this path. This is a community path. You're breaking the law." Chris chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair, watching her. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Karen, it's my property. It's not illegal if it's my land," he replied casually, giving her a calm, almost amused look. But Karen wasn't ready to back down. She marched up to the fence, her neon pink sneakers squeaking on the pavement, and stood there, glaring at Chris like a school teacher reprimanding a misbehaving student. "This path is vital to the community," she shouted, as though the very survival of the neighborhood depended on this path. "You're obstructing the flow of traffic. This is a public right-of-way." Chris felt the anger boiling up inside of him. He had tried to be patient, but this was getting ridiculous. Public right-of-way? It was his land, clearly marked as private property, and Karen was standing there spouting nonsense. "Karen, I don't know how many times I have to say this," Chris replied, now standing up, his voice calm but firm. "This land is mine. You don't get to dictate how I use it." Karen's face turned beet red. She was furious, but she had no argument left. She took one last, long, venomous glare at him and then stormed off to her car, slamming the door behind her. The following days brought even more tension. Chris thought the worst was over, but Karen had only just begun her campaign of harassment. It wasn't long before a brightly colored yellow violation notice appeared, stuck to his newly built fence. Chris stared at it for a moment, almost laughing. The notice claimed that he owed a fine of $500 for unauthorized construction and was ordered to remove the fence immediately. Chris didn't even need to read the entire notice. He had seen enough. This was Karen's way of continuing her vendetta. He peeled the notice off the fence and walked it inside, pinning it proudly on his refrigerator. "Nice try, Karen," he muttered to himself. He didn't care that the notice was official looking. He wasn't about to back down. As far as Chris was concerned, the more Karen pushed, the harder he would resist. Soon after, Karen began to rally others to her cause. She called in favors from her loyalists within the HOA, spreading rumors about Chris and his destructive actions. Some of the neighbors, who had once been friendly with Chris, started to look at him sideways. Whispers circulated, and Chris began to feel the cold shoulder from more and more people. But Chris wasn't intimidated. If anything, it only steeled his resolve. He added a few security cameras around his property to keep an eye on what was happening. "If she wants a fight, she's going to get one," he said to himself as he installed the last camera, a smug grin spreading across his face. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. One sunny afternoon, Chris was sitting on his porch, reading a book, when he noticed Karen pacing back and forth at the edge of his property. She was on the phone, her voice rising in frustration. Moments later, 2 police cars pulled up to his driveway. Chris raised an eyebrow, sensing that things were about to get interesting. The officers approached, looking slightly embarrassed. One of them cleared his throat and said, "We got a call about a blocked public road. Can you help us out here?" Chris couldn't help but laugh. He stood up, taking his time, and walked over to meet them. "That's not a public road," he said, gesturing to the fence. "It's my private property, and I have the deed to prove it." He handed the officers his property deed and a map of the township, both clearly showing that the strip of land in question was his, not the HOA's. The officers glanced at the documents, nodded in understanding, and turned to Karen. "Ma'am," one of them said with a sigh, "this is private land. He's within his rights to block access." Karen's face turned a bright shade of crimson as she fumed. "But it's been used for years," she argued, her voice shrill. "That makes it a public easement." The officer raised a hand, clearly done with the argument. "That's not how property rights work," he said curtly. "This is private property, and he has every right to restrict access. End of story." Karen wasn't about to give up without a fight. She glared at Chris, her eyes filled with fury. "This isn't over," she snarled, turning on her heel and storming back to her car. Chris stood there, watching her retreat, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. "Have a great day, Karen," he called after her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. As the days passed, Karen's efforts only escalated. She tried to send landscapers to remove the fence, claiming it was for community maintenance. But Chris was ready. He intercepted them, reminding them that they had no right to remove something on his property. Chris could sense that Karen was reaching her breaking point. She was no longer acting rationally, and the more she fought, the more her obsession with controlling the neighborhood became apparent. But Chris wasn't backing down. If anything, the more she pushed, the more determined he became. And then came the final, inevitable confrontation, a battle of wills that would determine who truly held the power in the neighborhood. Chris knew the war was far from over, but this time he was prepared. Chris had already anticipated Karen's next move. She had fought dirty before, so it was no surprise when she showed up on his doorstep once again. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had brought reinforcements, a group of HOA loyalists, ready to back her up in her quest to undo everything Chris had fought for. Karen was nothing if not persistent, and Chris knew this battle was far from over. It all came to a head one late afternoon when Chris was sitting on his porch, enjoying a quiet moment, when he heard the familiar sound of car engines rumbling in the distance. He squinted toward the street and saw a handful of cars slowly rolling up to his house. His heart sank, but he didn't flinch. This was it. The storm was coming. Karen was the first to step out of her car, her face a mask of pure fury. Her usual pastel-colored visor was nowhere to be found, replaced by an expression that seemed to scream, "I'm not going to let this go." She stormed up to Chris's porch, clipboard in hand like a knight wielding a sword, ready to wage war on the enemy. Behind her stood three of her most loyal followers, people who had always sided with her, their faces a mixture of confusion and hesitation. "Chris, we need to talk," Karen barked, her voice sharp and filled with a venom that made it clear she wasn't here to negotiate. Chris stood up from his chair, a slow grin creeping across his face as he crossed his arms over his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, and he was ready. "We've talked plenty, Karen, but I have a feeling this time you're not going to like the outcome." Karen's eyes narrowed. She had come too far to back down now. "You think you've won, don't you? But you've only made things worse for yourself. You're causing chaos in this neighborhood, and it needs to stop." Chris felt the anger bubbling up inside of him, but he kept his voice steady. "What chaos, Karen? This isn't about chaos. This is about me protecting my property. You've been walking all over me, thinking you can control everything." Karen's jaw clenched. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this, and she certainly wasn't used to being challenged. The rest of her little crew shifted uneasily behind her, sensing the tension in the air. Chris had never been so bold, and they didn't know how to react. But Karen wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. "You're blocking a vital community pathway," Karen continued, her voice trembling with indignation. "This land has been used as a shortcut for years. Your fence is not just an eyesore. It's a violation of the spirit of this neighborhood, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Chris tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with both frustration and amusement. "You've made this personal, Karen. You've crossed a line, and now you're not just messing with my fence, you're messing with my life." Karen's expression faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected this level of resistance from Chris, but she quickly recovered, her pride too great to let her show weakness. She raised her clipboard as if it were a weapon, pointing it at Chris like she could cut him down with it. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the HOA. You'll be getting a fine, and I'll make sure the board takes action against you. I'll make sure they remove that fence, Chris. This isn't over." Chris's smirk deepened. "Good luck with that, but you should know, I'm not backing down. You've pushed me too far." Before Karen could respond, Chris walked back into his house, leaving her standing on his porch, sputtering in disbelief. He knew that this wasn't the end of their battle. No, Karen would go to great lengths to make sure she had the last word. But he also knew that he had the upper hand now. It was only a matter of time before she revealed her true colors to the rest of the neighborhood, and when that happened, Chris was ready to make sure her reputation would be ruined. The following week, Chris received a letter from the HOA. It was an invitation to a meeting. The subject, his unauthorized fence, and the obstruction of community access. Chris read the letter, shaking his head. The HOA had finally caved to Karen's pressure, but he wasn't worried. In fact, he felt oddly calm. He had all the evidence he needed: his property deed, the security footage of neighbors and Karen herself trespassing, even photos of the damage to his yard caused by people driving through. He was going to bring it all to the meeting, and he was going to make sure Karen never had a chance to manipulate anyone again. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and Chris walked into the community center, folder in hand. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him as he entered, the silent judgment of neighbors who had been swayed by Karen's campaign of rumors. But Chris wasn't afraid. He had nothing to hide. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, her eyes fixed on Chris with a look that could have cut glass. She had that same smug expression, as if victory were already hers. But Chris wasn't intimidated. He had been through worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let a woman like Karen stand in the way of what was rightfully his. The HOA president, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere but here, began the meeting. Today, we're discussing the issue of Mr. Chris's fence. There are concerns about it blocking a community path, he said, his voice lacking any real conviction. Before anyone could speak, Karen jumped in. This fence is an affront to everything this neighborhood stands for. That path has been used for years. The whole community has relied on it. And now, Chris has come in and obstructed it for his own personal gain. It's unacceptable. Chris raised his hand, cutting her off. If I may, he said, his voice calm but firm, let me clarify something. This strip of land is private property. It's not a community easement. I have the deed to prove it. He slid the deed across the table, and the board members leaned forward, examining the document. Chris watched as Karen's face twisted in disbelief. She hadn't expected him to come prepared. Chris continued, just because people have used this land for years doesn't give them the right to do so. The community doesn't own it. I do. The board members began to murmur among themselves, some nodding in agreement. Karen's smugness faltered, and she could feel the tide turning. But she wasn't done yet. She tried one last desperate plea. This is about the community. We can't let one person disrupt everything. Chris's smile was barely restrained. Convenience doesn't trump property rights, Karen. The room fell silent as Chris pulled out the security footage. Neighbors, including Karen, were caught on camera trespassing across his land. It was a damning piece of evidence. The murmurs grew louder as the board members watched, some even looking embarrassed. One elderly woman on the board spoke up, her voice softer than the rest. Maybe it's time we let this go, Karen. We're making fools of ourselves. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Karen looked around, realizing her supporters were dwindling. It was over. The president cleared his throat. We've seen the evidence, and it's clear this land is Mr. Chris's property. There's nothing we can do here. We have no jurisdiction. Karen's face turned beet red. She stood up, slamming her hands on the table in frustration. You're all cowards, she screeched before storming out of the room, her heels echoing in the silence. Chris stood there, victorious. But as Karen stormed out, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had lost, and she was never going to have the power over this neighborhood again. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. And for Chris, that had been worth everything. Karen's exit from the HOA meeting wasn't the end of her fight. Not by a long shot. She wasn't the type of person to take defeat quietly. And Chris knew that her retreat wasn't out of acceptance. No, this was just the calm before the storm. The days after the meeting were unnervingly quiet. Chris kept to his usual routine, but the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors, who had once kept their distance, now avoided eye contact, whispering amongst themselves. They were caught in the middle of a war they never expected. Some were relieved to see Karen's influence beginning to wane, while others, those who had long been loyal to her, weren't so sure. It was a precarious balance. one that felt like it could tip in either direction. And then, one morning, the storm returned. Chris was enjoying his usual cup of coffee when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps on his driveway. He stepped outside, squinting against the bright sun, and saw Karen standing by his fence again, this time with an envelope in her hands. Her face was a strange mixture of fury and smug satisfaction. "Got something for me, Karen?" Chris asked, unable to hide the smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Karen didn't waste time with pleasantries. She thrust the envelope toward him, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who believed she had the upper hand. "I've had enough of this charade," she spat. "You're not going to get away with this." Not for long. Chris took the envelope, but his gaze didn't leave Karen's face. "What's this? Another one of your violation notices? You really can't let it go, can you?" With a flourish, Karen snapped back. "This is not a notice, Chris. This is a legal document. I'm taking you to court." Chris's expression flickered for a moment, then returned to a calm, almost bored look. He opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. It was from Karen's lawyer, demanding that Chris remove the fence immediately, claiming that it violated an unwritten community easement that had never been formally recorded, just a vague, unspecified right of the community to pass through the strip of land. Chris couldn't suppress the laughter that bubbled up inside him. "Unwritten easement?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched his reaction, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood there, her arms crossed tightly, her stance defiant. She was waiting for him to fold. She expected him to back down, to feel intimidated by the threat of a lawsuit. But Chris wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. He took a deep breath, looked at the letter again, and then at Karen. "This is a joke, Karen," he said quietly. "You're bluffing, and you know it." Chris didn't even bother to dignify the letter with a response. Instead, he folded it neatly, tucked it back into the envelope, and slid it into his back pocket. "I'll let my lawyer deal with this," he said, his voice cold. Karen's face twisted with frustration. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "This isn't over. You'll regret crossing me." Chris simply smiled, his hand resting casually on the gate. "I think you're the one who's going to regret this, Karen." She stormed off, but Chris didn't feel the slightest bit worried. He knew Karen's bark was worse than her bite. Her threats had no weight behind them. He had already gathered all the evidence he needed, and his lawyer was more than capable of handling any legal action she could throw his way. This was just another desperate move on her part. Yet, even as Karen's retreating figure faded from view, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and if she had one final card to play, he was certain it would be a dangerous one. The following days saw an escalation in the drama. Chris received a formal letter from his lawyer, confirming that Karen's lawsuit was in the works. But there was a twist. Karen wasn't stopping there. She had started a petition, rallying the other HOA members to her cause. She was trying to turn the community against him, painting him as the villain in the eyes of everyone who had once been her ally. Neighbors began to show up on Chris's doorstep. Some of them apologized for their previous behavior, their eyes full of shame for siding with Karen, while others were still hesitant, caught in the web of her manipulations. One afternoon, Chris came home to find a new visitor at his front door. It was Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had always been polite but distant, never truly taking sides. "Chris," she said, her voice shaky, "I owe you an apology." He raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "For what?" "For believing Karen," she replied softly. "She's been telling us all lies about you. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." Chris smiled, touched by the apology. "No hard feelings, Mrs. Clark. You were just doing what you thought was right." But there was more to come. Chris had become the talk of the neighborhood, and the whispers didn't stop. Karen's influence had been strong, but cracks were beginning to form. People were starting to realize that she had been abusing her power, and her reign of terror over the HOA was beginning to unravel. But Karen wasn't finished. She couldn't accept that her grip on the neighborhood was slipping away. One evening, as Chris sat on his porch, enjoying the quiet after a long day, his security cameras buzzed to life. He leaned forward, watching the footage on his phone with growing disbelief. There, on the screen, was Karen sneaking onto his property, bolt cutters in hand, trying to cut the lock off his gate. Chris's jaw tightened as he watched the footage, his anger rising. "That's it," he muttered under his breath. "She's crossed the line now." He had her on tape, attempting to break the law once again. But this time, Chris wasn't going to let her off the hook. This was more than just a petty feud. It was a violation of his privacy and property, and he wasn't going to stand for it. The next morning, Chris sent the footage to the local news station. They had been covering his saga for weeks, and he knew they would jump at the chance to show the world just how far Karen was willing to go. Within hours, the story was picked up, and the footage of Karen's failed bolt cutter mission went viral. Karen's reputation, which she had so carefully crafted over the years, crumbled in an instant. The neighborhood that had once feared her now saw her for what she truly was, a manipulative, power-hungry bully. Neighbors, who had once been too scared to speak out, now started to voice their support for Chris. They came to his door, offering apologies, even bringing him baked goods as a token of their appreciation. The tides had turned. The HOA, embarrassed by Karen's antics, was forced to issue an official apology to Chris. And when the dust finally settled, it was clear who had won this war. Chris had not only defended his property, but had also stood up for what was right, exposing Karen for the fraud she was. But the victory wasn't just about the fence or the land. It was about reclaiming his peace, his rights, and his community from the grip of someone who had tried to control it all. As Chris stood on his porch, looking out over the neighborhood, he finally felt a sense of relief. The chaos had passed, and with it, Karen's reign of terror. "Peace at last," he whispered, a quiet smile forming on his lips. The neighborhood was finally free. The neighborhood had, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, found peace. Chris stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands, staring out across the street at the empty sidewalk where Karen had once walked with her clipboard and sense of self-righteousness. The air was still, the kind of quiet that spoke of calm after a storm, the kind that promised new beginnings. But even in this calm, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one last chapter to this story, a chapter that would remind him just how far things had come and how deeply they had been changed. The victory against Karen, though sweet, had left behind more than just the remains of an HOA war. It had exposed the fragile dynamics of the neighborhood, the undercurrents of fear and power that Karen had controlled with such precision. It had also drawn lines in the sand, some of which could never be crossed again. The apology letter from the HOA had been a satisfying moment. After the viral footage of Karen's failed attempt to break into his property with bolt cutters made the news, the HOA, now thoroughly embarrassed, had no choice but to formally acknowledge Karen's overreach. The letter from the HOA president, confirming the community's new stance on Karen's actions, was framed and hung on the wall of Chris's living room as a symbol of the hard-won battle. But the neighborhood wasn't quite the same. Some neighbors who had once sided with Karen still kept their distance. They avoided eye contact, made polite small talk when necessary, but there was an invisible barrier between them and Chris. They had been her pawns for so long, too scared to question her authority. And now, standing on the other side of the battle, they didn't know where they belonged. It was a strange feeling for Chris to realize that this battle wasn't just with Karen, it was with the very fabric of the community. And some threads had been torn. Chris had expected this, of course. He knew that defeating Karen wasn't going to automatically repair the rifts she had caused. It wasn't as simple as a win and a loss. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. The damage done to the neighborhood's sense of unity was still very real, And though some people came forward to apologize and offer support, others remained silent, content to let things simmer without getting involved. Yet, amidst the quiet resentment and the awkward exchanges, there were glimmers of hope. Some of the neighbors, particularly those who had been quietly supportive of Chris throughout the ordeal, began to reach out in more meaningful ways. One by one, they started showing up on his doorstep, unannounced but welcome. It was one of these visits, just a week after Karen's final departure, that gave Chris the first true sense that the neighborhood might be healing. It was Miss S. Clark, the elderly woman who had previously apologized for believing Karen's lies. This time, though, she wasn't just offering her regrets. She was offering her help. "Chris," she said, standing in his doorway with a plate of homemade cookies, her expression serious but warm. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about what Karen did, and about how we all let her do it." Chris smiled softly, taking the plate from her. "It's been a lot. More than I think any of us realized at the time." Miss S. Clark nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I know, but I want to help fix it. We can't let her poison the whole neighborhood. Not anymore. We have to find a way to come together, to make things right." Chris was taken aback. He had expected Miss S. Clark to be one of those who would merely continue to keep her distance, hesitant to get involved in any more drama. But instead, here she was offering a hand in reconciliation, ready to take action. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, intrigued. She smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "I've lived here for decades, Chris. I know how people think, and I know how much Karen took advantage of that. But if we can gather the right people, we can start small, maybe a neighborhood meeting, just a simple get-together to talk about the kind of community we want, one where we all have a voice. No more secrets, no more fear." Chris felt something shift within him, a surge of hope he hadn't expected. He had been so focused on fighting Karen that he had forgotten how much power the people in this community really held. If they could unite, they could truly make the neighborhood theirs again. But it would take more than just one person to change things. "I like that idea," Chris said, his voice steady. "Let's do it. Let's bring people together. But it's not just about putting Karen behind us. It's about making sure this never happens again." Mrs. Clark nodded in agreement, and as she left his porch, she looked back at him with a sense of purpose. "You're not in this alone, Chris. We'll get through this. Together." The next few days were a whirlwind. Word spread quickly that there would be a neighborhood meeting, and to Chris's surprise, many of his neighbors, even those who had been silent during the whole Karen saga, showed up. The meeting was informal but meaningful, and it quickly became clear that Chris's fight was not only his own, it had become the community's fight as well. The room was filled with tension at first, hesitant words and awkward glances exchanged between people who hadn't spoken to each other in years. But Chris stood at the front, calm but resolute, and slowly, one by one, the walls came down. People began to speak, not just about the conflict with Karen, but about the fear they had lived with for so long, the fear of standing up, of being punished for their voices. They talked about how Karen had manipulated them into silence, how her strict rules had fractured the very spirit of the neighborhood. It was painful to listen to, but it was also necessary. The only way forward was through honesty, through acknowledging the harm that had been done. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense of something new, something fragile, but real, a resolution to be different, a promise to rebuild, to hold each other accountable, and to make sure no one would ever feel like an outsider in their own community again. Karen was gone, but her legacy had left its scars. Still, Chris felt a sense of peace as he looked around at his neighbors, some smiling, some wiping away tears, but all with a newfound sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The damage done was deep, and trust had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. But in that moment, Chris realized something crucial. The neighborhood wasn't just about fences and property lines. It was about the people who lived here, their connections, their support for one another. And as long as they could keep that intact, nothing could ever truly tear them apart. As the meeting ended, Chris stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. It felt like the storm had passed. But this time, it wasn't just the calm that followed. It was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in a long while, Chris felt like he truly belonged. In the days that followed the neighborhood meeting, the sense of unity that Chris had hoped for began to take root. Slowly, cautiously, the community began to rebuild itself, piece by fragile piece. The once fractured relationships between neighbors started to heal as they began to speak openly about their shared frustrations under Karen's reign. For the first time, there was a collective understanding that what had happened to Chris wasn't just his battle, it had been a reflection of the larger dysfunction that had taken hold of the entire neighborhood. But Chris soon realized that peace came at a price. As the days turned into weeks, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface began to bubble up again. While many residents were grateful for the new spirit of cooperation, a handful of others, those who had remained loyal to Karen, found themselves increasingly uncomfortable. They weren't ready to let go of the old ways, and their silence began to speak louder than ever before. They didn't like the new, more open dynamic. They didn't like the idea of a community where everyone was encouraged to speak freely, to question authority, to demand fairness. To them, Karen had been a pillar of strength, a beacon of order and discipline. And so, when Chris found an anonymous letter tucked under his front door one cool, quiet evening, he knew things were far from over. The letter was written in sharp, angry handwriting, and its contents were blunt, even threatening. You think you've won, but you've only made things worse. You've stirred up trouble where none existed. We won't stand by and let you ruin everything. Leave while you still can. If you don't, you'll regret it. Chris read the letter once, then again, his brow furrowing. This was no random act of hostility. It was a direct challenge, a warning. Someone in the neighborhood, still clinging to Karen's old ways, was determined to put him in his place. For a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. Had he gone too far? Was he pushing things too much, too soon? But then he shook the thought off. He'd already fought for his right to live freely, for his right to peace. He wasn't about to let the shadows of Karen's influence keep him from it. He went straight to his lawyer, showing them the letter. His lawyer's expression darkened as she read it. This is more than just a threat. It's an attempt to intimidate you, she said, her tone serious. You've done everything right, Chris, but you need to be prepared. This might escalate. If it does, we'll have to take legal action. You've made an enemy, and enemies don't disappear quietly. Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. He had known, deep down, that the road to peace wouldn't be easy. He had to be ready for whatever came next. And sure enough, the tension only continued to rise. It didn't take long for Chris to realize that the subtle undercurrents of animosity weren't just limited to one or two people. More and more, he began to notice the shift in the way people treated him. There were fewer friendly waves, fewer casual hellos. A coldness had settled in, a distance that hadn't been there before. Even Miss S. Clark, who had been one of his staunchest allies, began to withdraw. One evening, Chris walked past her house, and she was standing by the window, her eyes scanning the street. When she saw him, she quickly turned away. Chris paused, a sinking feeling in his chest. He had expected things to get better, to truly move forward with his neighbors, but instead, it seemed like the neighborhood was unraveling once more. And that wasn't the only change. The HOA board, which had been so quick to condemn Karen's actions and apologize to Chris, had begun to show signs of wavering. Rumors circulated that a faction of Karen's former supporters was regrouping, trying to reassert control. They began holding small, secretive meetings in hushed tones, whispering about ways to reverse the decisions that had been made. to restore the order that had once existed under Karen's rule. Chris had to act fast. He couldn't let the old regime creep back in. The thought of another battle, of reliving the chaos, made his stomach churn. But he couldn't sit back and let the fragile peace he'd fought for slip away. This time, he had to be proactive. A few days later, he received a call from a neighbor, Rick, someone who had always kept to himself. Rick was one of the few who hadn't fully sided with Karen or with Chris during the conflict, choosing instead to stay neutral. But now, it seemed, he had finally chosen a side. "Chris, we need to talk," Rick said, his voice low. "I've been hearing things. People are planning to take action against you, to push you out. They're organizing again. And it's not just about the fence anymore. It's about something bigger." Chris's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What are they planning?" Rick hesitated before answering. "They want to call for a recall of the HOA board. They're angry that Karen was ousted, and they think it's time to put someone in charge who'll return things to the way they were. They're not done with you, Chris. Not by a long shot." Chris felt the weight of the situation crashing down on him. "I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't over. But how can they do this? The board is supposed to be neutral." Rick's voice dropped even lower. "They're not neutral anymore. Some of them are with Karen's group. You need to be ready. If they succeed in getting a new board in, they'll undo everything. The peace, the progress, it'll all be for nothing." Chris's mind raced. The battle for his home, for his rights, wasn't just a personal one anymore. It was a fight for the future of the entire neighborhood. If Karen's followers succeeded in hijacking the HOA once more, they would undo everything he had worked for. The air of fear and control would return. He couldn't let that happen. The next few days were filled with preparation. Chris reached out to his lawyer again, seeking advice on how to prevent the takeover. They discussed the legalities of the HOA board's actions, the possibility of filing a lawsuit to ensure fair representation. It wasn't ideal, but if it came to that, Chris had no choice but to fight. And as the day of the HOA meeting loomed closer, Chris began to rally the neighbors who had supported him, those who had the courage to stand up to Karen. He knew that this battle would be different. It wouldn't be just about him. It would be about all of them. They would have to come together again, as they had before, to stop the creeping shadow of control from overtaking their lives once more. As Chris prepared for the battle ahead, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He knew that what he was about to face would be one of the hardest fights of his life. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. This time, the community he had fought for would fight beside him. And this time, he would make sure that peace, not fear, would prevail. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Chris stood at his front door, staring out at the neighborhood that had once seemed so peaceful, so full of promise. Now, it felt like a battlefield, with the winds of change whipping through the trees, carrying whispers of alliances and betrayals. He had seen what had happened before, and he knew how quickly the tide could turn. Karen's supporters were still lurking in the shadows, ready to seize back control of the community that had so briefly slipped through their fingers. This time, Chris wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had felt the sting of Karen's tyranny, for every neighbor who had suffered in silence and who had finally found the courage to stand up for what was right. Chris had spent the past few days preparing. He'd spoken with his lawyer, gathered evidence, and reached out to the allies he had made during his battle with Karen. It wasn't just about protecting the fence anymore. This was about ensuring that the HOA would never again become a tool of oppression, a vehicle for control and intimidation. As Chris entered the community center, his heart raced. The room was already filling up, the tension almost palpable. Neighbors were gathered in hushed conversations, exchanging cautious glances. The usual small talk that had once filled the space with warmth and laughter was now replaced by nervous energy. Some faces were familiar, others less so. It was clear that the lines had been drawn. Karen's supporters were scattered throughout the room, their eyes wary, their posture defensive. It was impossible to miss the subtle way they grouped together, whispering to one another as though plotting something. Chris didn't need to be a mind reader to know they were preparing for war. They wanted the board back in their hands, to undo the progress Chris had fought so hard to make, but he wasn't about to let them succeed. The meeting began with the HOA president, a middle-aged man named Ed, standing at the front of the room, trying his best to project calm. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. "Thank you all for coming today. As most of you know, we are here to discuss some important matters regarding the leadership of our HOA and the future direction of our community." His voice faltered slightly as he glanced at Chris, and it wasn't lost on anyone that Ed's gaze seemed to linger a moment too long. Ed had never been the most assertive president, and it was clear that his role in this meeting was going to be more passive than ever. Chris sat down, his hands resting on the table in front of him. His mind was sharp, focused. He'd been in too many fights to let the nerves creep in. He was ready. The first item on the agenda was the petition to recall the current board, spearheaded by Karen's loyalists. The room fell silent as one of the board members, a woman named Linda, stood up and presented the petition. Her voice was steady, but there was an underlying edge to it that betrayed her true feelings. "We believe the current board has failed to maintain the harmony of this community," Linda began. "Since the recent changes, there has been nothing but division. We need leadership that understands the importance of tradition and order. We can no longer allow one person to dictate how we live." Chris clenched his jaw. The insinuation was clear. She was talking about him. His decision to stand up to Karen had, in their eyes, destroyed the fabric of the neighborhood. It had become personal. But Chris wasn't going to let them paint him as the villain. Without hesitation, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room went quiet, every eye turning toward him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment from those who had been manipulated by Karen's lies. But Chris didn't flinch. "I've heard enough," Chris began, his voice calm but firm. "Let's be clear about something. This isn't about harmony or tradition. This is about control. This is about the fact that some of you can't stand, that someone dared to stand up and challenge Karen's grip on this neighborhood. And now, you want to undo everything." A murmur ran through the crowd, some in agreement, others fidgeting uncomfortably. Chris could see the faces of those who had once been intimidated by Karen's influence, now shifting in their seats, unsure of how to respond. Karen's reign of terror divided this community. She made every single one of us question if we had the right to be here, to live the way we wanted. Her petty rules, her bullying, her obsession with controlling everything, we all saw it. Some of us were too afraid to speak out, but I'm not afraid anymore. Chris's words cut through the tension in the room like a blade. He knew he had to make them see the truth. It wasn't about him. It was about the collective good of the community. He continued, his voice growing more passionate. "We don't need to return to the old ways. We don't need to live in fear of one person's overbearing control. What we need is respect. Respect for each other's rights. Respect for the idea that a neighborhood can be a place of peace, not a battleground." The room was still now, every person in the room hanging on his words. The old guard, those loyal to Karen, looked as though they were about to speak. But Chris wasn't done. "This isn't just about a fence. It's about all of us, the neighborhood we choose to create together, a community where we support one another, not tear each other down." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, slowly, one person stood up. It was Rick, the neighbor who had first warned Chris about Karen's remaining supporters. He raised his hand, his voice hesitant at first. "I agree with Chris," Rick said, his words steady but full of conviction. "I've lived here for years, and I've seen the fear Karen instilled in all of us. But we don't have to live like that. We can do better. We owe it to ourselves to make this place a community, not a war zone." One by one, more neighbors began to stand, each one adding their voice to the growing chorus. Miss S. Clark, who had been quiet until now, stood next, her voice wavering but strong. I've been here longer than most of you, and I've seen how things used to be. But I also see the kind of neighborhood we could have if we stop letting fear control us. We need to move forward, not backward. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The momentum was building, and Chris could feel it. His heart raced, but he held his ground. The more people spoke, the more Karen's supporters shrank back, their resolve weakening in the face of such a united front. It wasn't just about defending his property anymore. It was about defending the idea that a community should be built on mutual respect, not fear and control. And it seemed that, at least for now, that message was resonating. As the meeting drew to a close, the vote was clear. The petition to recall the board was overwhelmingly rejected. Karen's reign was over. Her influence had crumbled, and with it, the toxic atmosphere she'd cultivated for so long. But Chris knew this victory wasn't the end. The battle for the soul of the neighborhood was ongoing, and while he had won this round, the true challenge would be in keeping the peace, in making sure that the fear and division Karen had sown would never take root again. For now, though, he could breathe easier. He had stood up when it mattered most, and together with his neighbors, they had taken their community back. And as he walked out of the community center, a sense of peace washed over him. He had done what he set out to do. The war was over, and now it was time to rebuild. Weeks passed since the HOA meeting, and the dust that had once been so thick in the air began to settle. The neighborhood that Chris had fought so fiercely to reclaim from Karen's grip was slowly starting to feel like a home again. But it wasn't easy. The work of rebuilding trust, of restoring what had been broken, wasn't something that could happen overnight. Yet, there was a quiet strength in the neighborhood now, a resilience that Chris had helped awaken in the most unexpected of ways. Chris had always prided himself on being the kind of person who kept his head down, who didn't look for conflict. He had bought his home in the hopes of finding peace, away from the chaos of the city, where he could quietly pursue his dreams without interruption. But peace, it turned out, was never guaranteed. It was something you had to fight for. And it wasn't always as simple as signing a few petitions or showing up at a meeting. It was about standing up for what was right, even when every part of you wanted to back down. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. As he sat on his porch, watching the evening sun dip below the horizon, Chris couldn't help but reflect on the journey. The battle had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and at times it had seemed like an impossible fight. He had gone head-to-head with Karen and her loyalists, endured the threats, the subtle isolation, and the overwhelming sense that he was fighting against not just one woman, but an entire system. Yet somehow, against all odds, he had come out on top. The fence that had been the spark of this entire conflict still stood tall at the edge of his property. It was more than just a barrier. It was a symbol of defiance, of his refusal to let anyone dictate his life. It was a reminder of the moment when he had taken back control, not just of the land, but of his sense of self, his right to exist in the neighborhood without fear of being silenced. Every time Chris looked at the fence, he was reminded of the choice he made that day to not let Karen or anyone else push him around. But there was something else that kept coming back to him, the faces of his neighbors, the ones who had silently followed Karen's rule out of fear, and those who had stood by him, offering their support. He had fought not just for his own freedom, but for theirs as well. For so long, the people of this neighborhood had lived in quiet submission, too afraid to speak up, to challenge the status quo. Chris had broken that silence, but it hadn't been easy. It was a few days after the meeting, when Chris was sitting in his living room, flipping through old photo albums, that he came across something unexpected. It was a letter, a simple, handwritten note, placed delicately on his coffee table. It wasn't signed, But there was no mistaking the handwriting. It was from Mrs. Clark. "Dear Chris," it began, "I wanted to take a moment to thank you. I know that when this all started, I was hesitant. I had lived here long enough to know that sometimes it's better to just keep your head down. But you showed me something important sometimes. It's worth standing up, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. And I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner. You gave us all a chance at something better. I'm not sure where things will go from here, but I know I'm not going to let fear control me anymore. Thank you, Chris. We owe you more than we can ever say." Chris paused for a moment, staring at the words on the page. Miss S. Clark was one of the quietest people in the neighborhood, the type to keep to herself and avoid any sort of drama. Her letter was a reminder of how deeply the impact of his actions had spread, how the courage to stand up for himself had inspired others to do the same. But there was something else in the letter, a vulnerability that made Chris realize how much he had underestimated the lasting effects of Karen's reign. She had created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, making everyone question whether they had the right to simply exist on their own terms. Karen had made people feel small, but now they were starting to feel empowered again. The work of rebuilding wasn't just about mending the broken pieces of the HOA. It was about healing the wounds that Karen had left in the hearts of the people who had lived under her control. Chris put the letter down and stared out the window, the weight of what he had done settling in. He had fought a battle, yes, but he had also won something far more valuable: the belief that change was possible, that people could come together to make their lives better, to create a community that wasn't driven by fear, but by respect and understanding. And it had all started with a single decision, a single act of defiance against the tyranny that had taken root. Still, he knew that the scars left by Karen's influence would not vanish overnight. He had witnessed firsthand the lengths to which she had gone to divide the neighborhood, to turn friends into enemies, neighbors into strangers. It was going to take time for trust to be rebuilt, for the awkward silences and sideways glances to fade. But Chris also knew that the work of healing had begun, and that was something worth fighting for. One evening, as Chris was out in his yard, tending to his garden, he noticed a familiar face walking down the street. It was Rick, the neighbor who had first alerted him to Karen's supporters regrouping. This time, Rick wasn't walking past his house. He was walking toward it. Chris stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and waved. Rick hesitated for a moment, then walked over with a friendly smile on his face. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Rick began, a sheepish look crossing his face. "I just wanted to say thanks. You don't know how much it means that you stood up. You made all of us realize that we had been letting someone control us for too long. I'm not proud of the fact that I stayed quiet, but you've made me see that it's time to change." Chris smiled, relieved by the sincerity in Rick's voice. "It wasn't just me, Rick. It was all of us. We're all in this together. And it's not going to be easy, but we've already come so far." Rick nodded. "Yeah, and I want to be part of making things better. I know I didn't speak up before, but I'm ready now." Chris extended his hand, a gesture of solidarity, a promise that the fight for peace didn't end with one victory. It was ongoing, a shared effort. "Let's make sure we keep it that way," he said quietly, knowing that this was just the beginning of the true work of rebuilding their community. As the sun set behind him, casting the street in a warm, golden light, Chris felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The journey had been long, full of obstacles and heartache, but in the end, it had been worth it. He hadn't just fought for his right to be left alone. He had fought for the kind of community where people could speak their minds without fear. He had fought for a place where peace wasn't something you had to earn, it was something everyone deserved. And as he watched his neighbors come together, one by one, he knew that they had all learned an invaluable lesson. True strength doesn't come from power or control, it comes from the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost.